Okay, guys, so today we'll be talking about an exciting topic. I hope that you'll have a lot of questions for me today about this. Then it involves a very intriguing discussion about what is thinking, planning, deciding, and ultimately what does it mean to have higher level cognition that actually kind of distinguishes us as a human race from the rest of the animal kingdom in this particular kind of things, and higher level cognitive function in this kind of domain. Before we start, any questions about the previous materials or any general inquiries about what's going on? Basically, in terms of the general set of lectures or anything else, please let me know. We'll take 1 minute to do that, and then we can get started. أي أسئلة؟ Everything okay with the previous content? أي حدا مش فاهم أي نقطة؟ يعني كمان مرة للتذكير, that's why I'm here. I'm here to explain these things to you guys. You will need to put down the effort. ولكن نستغل الفرصة. يعني if you have a question, please ask. And by the way, let me tell you something. There is nothing called a stupid question. Nothing. Okay? They're all good questions. تقى تفضلي.
دكتور كنت بدي أسأل عن الأوامر اللي بتيجي من الكورتكس كلها بتروح على البيزل جانجليا ولا في أشياء بتمرش من هناك؟
يعني بالنسبة مثلا احنا بنحكي هون بنحكي عن particular circuits. إذا هي من جزء من الكورتيكوستريتال لوبس يس. بس مثل ما أنت عارفة مثلا في كثير أشياء بتروح من الكورتكس مباشرة على البيراميدز, مزبوط. وفي أشياء كثيرة من الكورتكس بتروح على كورتكس ثانية. أكيد هذا الكلام لازم درستوه في الكورتكس والإبيليبسي in particular, كيف بصير الجنراليزيشن of things. وفي كثير أشياء بتروح من الكورتكس على الميد برين, وفي كثير أشياء بتروح من الكورتكس على البرين ستيم, وفي كثير أشياء بتروح من الكورتكس على الهايبوثالاموس وعلى الثالاموس. And so it's a huge network of things. Okay. ولكن نقطة مهمة إنه طبعا في multiple, أكيد شفتوا كيف الاركيتكتشر تبع الكورتكس, رح نحكي شوي عنه اليوم. إنه basically we have 6 layers of cells. طبعا هذا كلام in the visual cortex. It's kind of the model cortex. بينما في other cortices that have 3 layers, 4 layers, 5 layers as well. So basically, generally speaking, the cortex projects everywhere. Okay, تقى؟
طب لما نحكي الإكسترا بيراميدال تراكت يعني زي إيش بتروح هناك؟
أنت بدك تحكي لي, حكينا عنه أول محاضرة هذا, وأكشلي ثاني محاضرة عشان نكون دقيق. بتروح على البيزل جانجليا مثلا, بتروح على
يس بس قصدي إيش هي زي إيش يعني الأوامر هاي؟
modulation of movement, cognition, emotion, eye movement, you see. يعني basically the discussion of the corticostriatal loops. ارجع الى اللكتشر تبعت الcorticostriatal loops, شوف شو الاربعه loops هذول, كل واحد شو بتعمل. That's one example على extra pyramidal aspect of things. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Any other questions? Again, جماعة, feel free. That's the reason why we're here.
دكتور الإفكت تبع الدوبامين على السترياتهم بيكون حسب نوع الريسبتور صح؟
بالضبط, exactly.
وحسب نوع الريسبتور بتفرق يعني بتصير indirect ولا direct؟
حسب نوع الريسبتور اللي على الميديوم سبايني نيورون بصير عندنا هذا البروجكشن نيورون, يا اما بروح دايركت على الاوتبوت, اوكي, اذا كان على دي 1, او بروح على ال external component of the pallidum of the basically you know what we call the pallidum, right? Globus pallidus. All right. External globus pallidus. وبعدين بيكمل في الانdirect pathway على ال subthalamic nucleus and then ultimately to the output nuclei. اوكي تقى؟
بزبط تصير تأثير الدايركت باثوي بدون الدوبامين؟
بزبط تأثير الدايركت باثوي بس بدون الدوبامين. absolutely. ليش؟ لأنه الدوبامين
اللي جاي من الكورتكس هي اللي
بتحدث. تذكر كيف حكينا على الهيد of the spine or the neck of the spine, دوبامين يجي على الneck of the spine, بينما الهيد of the spine is always being activated by glutamate.
Yes.
Okay. Great. Please ask يا جماعة كمان مرة, يعني this is important, use the opportunity. كمان مرة بهدف الفهم يعني مش I don't think you should worry about the exams. The exams are going to be basically NMBE and basically or NBME, whatever it's actually the pronunciation is for it. And then ultimately يعني اهتموا تتعلموا الأشياء هذه لأنه ultimately you will see it later in your clinical practice.
دكتور
تفضل.
هلا الاوتبوت للاندايركت مش نفسها للدايركت، يعني الدايركت بتسوي اكتيفيشن صح والاندايركت انهبيتنج ولا لا؟
انت بدك تحكي لي احمد الاندايركت.
انا حسب ما سمعت في المحاضره انت حكيت انهم نفس الشيء، بس لما رجعت شفت انه لا، الاندايركت انهبيتنج بتسوي والدايركت بتسوي اكتيفيتنج كاوتبوت كنهايه.
انا حكيت انه بصير يعملوا نفس الشيء في حاله الريليس اوف دوبامين. مظبوط. في حاله الريليس اوف دوبامين الاوتكم تبعهم على الاوتبوت نيوكلياي تبعون بيزل جانجليا is similar. You see? So that's what you would consider. انه اذا if I have dopamine released, طبعا الدوبامين is not released in a generalizable manner, it's released in a specific manner مثل ما اتفقنا. وفرجيتكم كيف البارسليشن تبع السبستانشا نيجرا بارس كومباكتا in this kind of sense. ولكن بديش اياكم تاخذوا الامور in a generalized manner. واحد بيعمل excitation واحد بيعمل inhibition. It's not how physiology works. Okay, بدنا نمشي في الباث. Okay, الموضوع don't memorize, understand. That's actually the difference between somebody who understands the basic concepts in physiology and can answer questions and somebody who memorizes in basal ganglia direct pathway excitation with indirect pathways and inhibition. People say that, ولكن it's not exactly what happens. You see? Okay, أحمد.
بس لما يعني قد ما تفرز دي 2 مش راح تغير من الاندايركت، ولا ممكن يغير يسوي بالضبط زي الدايركت؟
I don't understand the question. يعني كيف؟
يعني قد ما صار اكتيفيشن للدي 2 ريسبتور، هل راح يغير يغير من الافكت على الثالاموس بالاندايركت باثواي؟ ممكن يعني.
Of course.
يعني
Absolutely. Actually, D2 receptors from a pharmacokinetics component, they're much faster, much quicker than the D1 receptor. Okay, فبالتالي less dopamine is needed to match the effect of the direct pathway. D1 are slower. Okay, so we don't say that usually, and it's more of like an advanced topic. But it's known that actually the amount of dopamine that you need on the indirect pathway is much less in order to kind of cause the inhibition of the direct pathway cells. Yeah.
كان سؤالي انه يعني انه الدوبامين هنا بيسوي يعني بلس مينوس، مش انه 180 درجه بغير الافكت تبعت الاندايركت باثواي اللي كانت من الكورتكس.
مثل ما اتفقنا الدوبامين is modulatory على neck of the spine, not on the head of the spine. It's not the only input either, يعني هو بيعدل اي شيء بيجي من الكورتكس.
بس ما بغير، يعني ما بغيرها 180 درجه. فهمت علي شو قصدي؟
ما فيش شيء اسمه 180 درجه وصفر في when it comes to neuroscience احمد. Okay, so now let me suggest the following. I think you should go and listen to the lecture again. لأنه these are really basic concepts that we explained there. So it's really important that you really get that full picture of things. وبعدها reach out to me if you have any questions. Okay, that's extremely important. لأنه يعني هاي الأشياء we have covered. Okay, and I will be happy to answer and explain things that يعني فيها شوية إشكال. بس we want to dedicate the time of this lecture entirely لأنه هذا راح يضطر إن نشرح كل الباثوي كمان مرة. All right.
صح ماشي شكرا.
So basically, go ahead and listen to the lecture again. وأي حدا من الزملاء طبعا. And then ultimately reach out to me if you have any questions. تفضل.
شكرا.
دكتور بس آخر سؤال، الكورتكس صح لما توصل الجلوتاميت على الستريتم وفي نفس الوقت يجي من الدوبامين على الدي 2، مين راح يكون اكسايتاتوري ولا انهبيتوري الإفكت؟
بجاوبك نفس جواب أحمد هنا. Go and listen to the lecture. You should know that.
سمعتها.
اسمعها كمان مرة. I don't think you heard it enough. عرفتي كيف؟ So that's كمان مرة. إذا كان D1 في عليه effect على ال medium spiny neurons. إذا كان D2 it has another effect على ال medium spiny neurons.
يس بس قصدي لو اجى جلوتاميت من الكورتكس واجى كمان برضو الدوبامين على الدي 2، جلوتاميت بيعمل اكسايتاتوري والدي 2 بيعمل انهبيتوري، فراح يكون النت ريزلت اكسايتاتوري ولا انهبيتوري؟
كان راح يكون النت ريزلت مثل ما اتفقنا، راح يكون inhibitory لانه it's modulated. Okay, it's modulated. What we're talking about is modulation. بس مش صفر او واحد. موضوع مش صفر زي ما حكى احمد او 180 درجه. It's not like this. في gradations response. Okay, هذا بنسميه firing rate. فجيتكم كيف الشيء اللي بنسميه rasters of these neurons. And then ultimately what I want you to think is basically, and again, I don't want to, يعني في physiology, neurophysiology in particular, you cannot think about, extremes. لأنه what does it mean to modulate؟ مثل ما اتفقنا كمان مرة modulation معناته بغير الإفكت شوي بعدله. alright؟ ف it's not exactly صفر أو واحد. It's not active or inactive. Okay? So Ahmed, maybe this addresses your question as well. And it's mainly these gradations. ولكن يعني كمان مرة I cannot spend all of the time re-explaining this, and it was covered in the lecture. Okay? So basically, go back to it, and كمان مرة reach out, guys. If you have any questions after that, إذا في شيء مش واضح, we'll happily hold another session to explain things to you. Okay? Okay, doke. All right, let's talk about thinking now. We have been thinking about dopamine and the exciting questions by Tuqa and Ahmed. Thank you guys for the questions. And again, go back to the lecture, جماعة, اسمعوهم. And لأنه يعني I can answer the questions for you. I can provide you the immediate answers. ولكن it's not the exercise that I want here. I want you to put down the effort first. وبجوز بعضكم سمع اللكتشرز بس اسمعوها كمان مرة. اقرأوا لي المحاضرة الشابتر actually. Alright? تقرأوش بس notes رجاء. يعني that's actually really the whole point behind this discussion. إنه تتعودوا تقرأوا text. يشوفوا بالضبط كيف الأمور هاي بتتم in the brain, and then ultimately how does that actually help you. بس at the same time إذا في أشياء بنقدر نحلها هنا في المحاضرة during the time, I'll be happy to. أشياء بدها وقت, okay, I'll refer you back to the lectures. and تسمعهم كمان مرة, بعدها بضل الأسئلة بعد القراءة وبعد lectures and research, then you come back to me and I'll answer them. What is thinking? شو يعني thinking؟ مثل ما تعودنا في المحاضرات الماضية بدنا نعرفها مشان basically so we can move forward in terms of what this actually means and entails, and how does that actually affect our ability to infer things. لما أنا أجي أحكي التفكير, شو التفكير؟
process
So
using
okay, تفضل, go ahead. Process using what?
informations موجودة عندي بهدف الجول إني أصل مثلا لنتيجة معينة أو أفهم شيء معين.
إذن جمال عم بحكي
الانفورميشن ممكن يجيبوها من الميموري أو ممكن يجيبوها من الرياليتي.
So thinking is processing using information that exists currently in my memory or things that are from the environment. Okay, thank you, Jamal. And شو البروسيس, شو بصير فيها يعني؟ Okay, it is a process, but what happens? يعني كمان مرة فكر as physiologists here. احنا نحاول نفكر as neurophysiologists. لما احكي process, it's a black box. هذه البروسيس. What is happening inside? مين بده يحاول؟ كمان مرة there are no right answers here. موضوع مش يا بتعرفوا يا بتعرفوش هنا. That's actually the beauty of the philosophy of science. إنه بخلينا نفكر beyond, the topics and beyond the definitions and beyond the modules that we think are actually governing this world. شو يعني تفكير؟ شو يعني تخطيط؟ محمد تفضل.
ممكن نحكي التفكير هو البروسيس اوف زي juggling thoughts, نربطهم ببعض, نشوف الاسوسيشنز, اشياء زي هيك.
So محمد بحكي لنا it's all about associations and نربطهم ببعض. Okay, basically great. جمال بحكي لنا it's related to basically linking these ideas with the existing memory. And تيمة تفضلي.
ممكن evaluating الoptions اللي قدامنا based on our like personal interest or preferences or what's the best like what would provide the best outcome in this situation.
So Taima is telling us evaluation as well, and assessment, and making particular forming particular thoughts about the options that are in front of us. What else? Does it include deciding تفكير? What do you think?
والoutcome output تاعها.
So we have a particular component where it's deciding. طب does it include making responses? تفكير.
Responses as in actions?
as in actions?
Like I think thinking precedes actions, so like tribe is considered part of it, or it should preceding it.
So Taima is telling us no, it actually should precede actions. طيب Taima لو كان البروسيس اللي بحكي عنها أنا is incremental، يعني بدي أفكر في شغله وأعمل action وبناء عليه بدي أفكر في كمان شغله وأعمل action وبناء عليه بدي أفكر كمان شغله وأعمل action. Then does thinking include action or does not?
ممكن يكون surface thinking will action part of something أكبر.
Which is what we called,
planning.
Conditioning.
Oh.
Okay. So أعطينا هذا الكلام, So that's where I want to go. I want to go with this here into, again, the basic constructs that would allow us to, divide this. وأحسن تقسيم لهذا الكلام هو actually the categorization of memory. بس راح نستعمله مشان نفهم what is thinking and what is higher cognitive function in this particular aspect. راح نحكي على 2 topics هنا. راح نحكي على thinking, planning, and deciding. راح نغطي فيه short-term memory as well to some extent. And then we will be talking about language. Language is the hallmark of what we call higher cognitive function. اللي بيميز الإنسان كما مرة على ما تبقى من المملكة الحيوانية. Okay? So thinking is a process. It involves seeing the options, assessing the stimuli, all right? Assessing the environment, the context, processing that in the capacity of what we know and what we learn, what were learned in the past, our memories, okay, either implicit or explicit or emotional, and then making selections. And these selections are thought-based initially. يعني بحكي أنا بدي I want to go in that direction. I want to go in that direction. And then making the action that actually accompanies the idea. إذا كان multiple step, we're talking about multiple step. Okay? Where مثل ما يعني حكينا قبل شوي, it actually becomes more part of the thinking process in order to evaluate, assess, and then make a response. All right? And the reality, again, it's not an easy topic to define in terms of the thinking. And in a lot of times, you will see people talking about the cortex. احنا هو اللي بيميزنا كبشر احنا is basically our القشرة الدماغية, and so on and so forth. And basically هي اللي بيسموها executive function. Okay? Executive functions. يعني هل معنى هذا الكلام انه المخلوقات الثانية ما عندها executive functions؟ ما عندها planning؟ Of course they have planning. بس the planning هذا is not, it does not follow the same thought process that we have as humans. All right? So that's, in a nutshell, what this process is all about. And ultimately, what we're talking about here is all of these, amazingly developed, amazingly expanded cortical areas that we have as Homo sapiens, مقارنة فيما تبقى كما مرة من across the phylogeny or across the rest of the animal kingdom, in this kind of regard. Considering that actually, there are basic principles upon which we can understand brain structure and ultimately brain function, again, across species. إذن اليوم راح نحكي عن مناطق الكورتكس, القشرة الدماغية. In particular, راح نحكي عن prefrontal cortex, راح نحكي عن cingulate cortex, راح نحكي عن orbitofrontal cortex, and then we will be talking about, the posterior components, the anterior and posterior cingulate cortices in this kind of regard. Okay, and تعليقا على النقطة اللي حكتها تقى واللي سألها أحمد as well, many of these discussions will include the basal ganglia. ليش؟ لأنه these are the corticostriatal loops that connect a lot of these particular aspects of the cortex to these areas. هي extrastriatal, extra pyramidal عفوا يا تقى, okay, اللي نحكي عنه هنا. مش بس البيزال جانجليا, الاميجدالا, the entorhinal cortex, the hippocampus. Then we're talking about basically about memory in a sense, or habits, explicit or implicit or emotional. All right. So in a lot of ways, we're trying to interpret or explain how does our ability to make decisions connect to our experiences. Okay. How do we perceive the environment outside connected to our internal milieu or internal environment, which is memories, whichever type of it is, and then ultimately make decisions. وشفنا في المحاضرة الماضية كيف إنه basically it's not all the time that I need my cortex. It could become reflexive with training طبعا, with exposure. And especially if it's fear related, you don't even access the cortex in many times. Some of the reptilian brain concept. مين بيعرف شو يعني reptilian brain? What differentiates the reptilian brain from the human brain? I just talked about it. Educated guess. شو بيميز دماغ التمساح عن دماغ الإنسان؟ Okay, maybe an assignment for you guys if nobody knows. It's تفضلي, go ahead.
Emotions.
Structure wise.
Limbic system.
Limbic system is much more pronounced, much stronger. في كل الحيوانات أكثر من الإنسان.
Neocortex.
Well, it is a neocortex. Mohammed, what do you think?
لأنه بالعادة بيكون smooth.
So it is ما فيها الجايريشن هذا الموجود في والسيل سايد الموجودة في الماء الإنسان أولا. Plus it lacks most of the cortex. ما في neocortex. Okay? كأنه يعني basically a little bit of thalamus, a little bit of basal ganglia, a little bit of cortex, that very necessary, and then you go down to the the midbrain component and to the brainstem component, and then ultimately يعني it's very reflexive, in other words. Okay? مقارنة في الإنسان الأشياء بتاخذ وقتها تروح على الكورتكس, بعدين الكورتكس بتحكي مع أشياء ثانية subcortically, and then things actually go back to the cortex and then get processed, and it produces voluntary movement or potentially emotional movements and so on and so forth زي ما شفنا في المحاضرات الماضية. Okay, so it does take time in the human. Most of the animals, it's instinctive, okay, reflexive. That actually is the way that we think about it. على كل. So the basic areas that we'll be talking about is the orbital frontal cortex, ventromedial prefrontal cortex. مين بتذكر امبارح شو حكينا شو أهمية ventromedial prefrontal cortex? We mentioned it very briefly. مين انتبه الموضوع؟ كيف it's important for the suppression of the amygdala activity, and in patients with PTSD it's less active. ذكروا؟
تمام.
CBT works on reducing amygdala, like
Exactly, and CBT works on increasing activity in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and reducing hyperactivity in the amygdala. And orbital frontal cortex, يعني orbital frontal, orbit, this is the orbit, okay? It's basically here, beneath your orbits, in a sense, okay? And as you could tell, it's very well protected هاي المنطقة, for a reason. مين بيعرف إذا صار عندنا damage في هاي المنطقة شو بصير؟ neurology. شو أهم symptom تطلعوا عليه؟
coordination.
No. Like motor.
لا
cerebellum.
قصدي coordination in thought.
Yeah, بس شيء أهم كثير أوضح. كمان مرة, common is common. What is the most common presentation in patients who have orbital frontal or even prefrontal cortex damage in their brain?
ممكن اللي شخصيتهم ممكن تتغير.
Precisely, exactly. Thank you, Mohammed. It's exactly personality changes. بيجوا الأهل يحكوا لكم صار يعمل تصرفات مش ما كان يعملها سابقا أبدا. You see? And then ultimately بصيروا يستعملوا كلمات سيئة الناس, بصيروا يسب كتير, مقابل يكون سابقا هادي, ما بحكيش مع حدا عفوا يعني. And then ultimately it has names in neurology. طبعا I don't want to get into the details now. You will probably discuss this in the midst of discussing neurology in your clinical years. So أهم شغلة, changes in personality. What is personality? It's our ability to think, our ability to reflect on our own experiences, connect them to other parts of our memory, reflect this on the environment, and make decisions accordingly. This is what personality is in a sense. Okay? And if you have damage there, you will see changes in personality. ليش هذا الكلام مهم؟ مثل ما درسنا في visual system, it's a localization system for you as a medical doctor. إذا أنا بشوف إنه في changes في personality, immediately go there. Okay? Immediately start thinking about this. and طبعا في many different tests that you can do where basically people start ignoring one half of or one side of things. مثلا بصيروا لو تطلب منهم يرسموا ساعة برسموا ساعة بنص جزء منها بس they completely ignore the other side of it. So a lot of things actually to kind of consider there. Okay, without further ado, let me just go into the details of what does it mean to process information in the cortex. What is thinking? How can we actually properly categorize and consider thinking? إذن كما بدي استعمل اللي حكوا لنا يا الزملاء في البداية. We have an environment فيها stimuli. بناء على الانفايرمنت هذه بدنا we want to plan for a response and بناء على الريسبونس بدنا نشوف الاوتكمز. ذكركم في شيء هذه؟ stimulus response outcome or CS US and response?
Like conditional.
It's conditioning. Instrumental initially وبعدين نحكي عن classical. اوكي ولكن at the same time هي خلينا نستعمل الانسترومنتال conditioning لانه اوضح لانه فيها responding, so it makes an actual voluntary action that we make that would allow us actually kind of to consider the whole aspect of thinking better. اذا لما انا اجي اقيم الستيمولس لما اطلع على شيء في الانفايرمنت تبعي انا basically what are the things that we pay attention to؟ شو رايكم؟
Sensory information.
Sensory component. What else? Taima and others, please participate.
كمان
الميموري والباست اكسبيرمنت.
Memory and past experiences. ولكن يعني did I see this or not? Exactly, Jamal. And what else?
إذا في reward من الإشي اللي ممكن يصير.
ممتاز. شو بنسميها الكلمة تيمة؟ The value of the stimulus. Okay. Does it have a value or not? Is it fearful or not? Is it rewarded or not? هل هذه يعني قطعة الخضار ولا الفواكه إذا أكلتها would I get sick or not? Okay. So this is a particular evaluation of what happens when you see a stimulus. The sensory aspect of شو لونها الشغله اللي بتشوفوها في الانفايرمنت تبعتكم. وين البوزيشن تبعها. كل واحده should relate to one of the lectures that we talked about by the way. شو لونها بنعرف ليش. شو اللي بيخلينا نشوف لون الشغله.
الكونز.
The cones precisely. وين مكانها. شو اللي بيخلينا نعرف وين مكانها البوزيشن تبعها. ذكروا. Place cells and grid cells, hippocampus, entorhinal cortex. كمان مرة رجاء اسمعوا lectures كويس. That's actually مشان تجمعهم مع بعض. That's actually the whole point here. يجمعهم مع بعض and then ultimately you will see that actually there are a lot of pieces that would make you understand the system. ولكن again I understand the struggle here جماعة. يعني I spent the past decade of my life actually studying these things and thinking about them. I don't expect you to kind of really connect the dots without having proper access to this information for some sufficient time. And that's actually another component that we need to consider when it comes to thinking. It does need time. بجوز قلت لكم في مقولة لألبرت أينشتاين. He says, I'm not smarter than others. I just spent enough time with the problem. Okay. طبعا في كلية الطب حدث ولا حرج. كله مستعجل بده يخلص المحاضرات. مزبوط. مش هيك اللي بتمروا فيه. وكله مستعجل بده يخلص المادة تبعته. انتم مستعجلين انكم تخلصوا الامتحانات تخرجوا وتصيروا دكاترة ولا لا؟ غلطان أنا؟ Okay, so in a sense حكينا عن positioning, حكينا عن sensory aspect of the stimuli, and then ultimately we'll be talking about the value of the stimulus. What helps us decide the value of the stimulus? It is this structure that we call the orbital frontal cortex in particular. And خليني أضيف عليه the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. طيب سؤال لتقى اللي سألتني عن الدوبامين. So تقى, do we have dopamine in the orbital frontal cortex?
I don't know.
You should know. You should know. I mentioned this. شو بتذكر لما حكينا عن VTA, ventral tegmental area, and the projections of the ventral tegmental area to شو سمينا الباثواي؟ mesocortical. مش مذاكرين؟
بلا صح.
Okay, very good. So كمان مرة يا جماعة, study this material and listen to the lectures with a different kind of sense of what this means. And then the orbitofrontal cortex receives dopamine, the prefrontal cortex, most of the topics I will talk about today receive a lot of dopamine inputs. And then as such, there is dopamine modulation. طب ممكن تقى أو حد ثاني من الزملاء يسألنا طيب كيف بصير المodulation هناك? How does it happen? Where does dopamine end up being? It ends up being, again, similarly, in a modulatory effect, mostly on the necks of the spines, on the projection cells, okay? أو بعضهم على interneurons in the cortex. عشان تعمل modulation of the response that you see in the cortex. And شو قلنا الدوبامين له دخل في شيء بنسميه reward prediction error. مثل ما شفنا في الستاديز تبعت وولفرام شولتز المحاضرة الماضية والمحاضرة اللي قبلها محاضرة البيزل جانجليا اللي حكينا شوي عن الموضوع. So what do we see here? We see a lot of things that are related to reward value or potentially punishment value. راح نشوف بجوز البانشمنت إلى أكثر علاقة فيما ما يسمى ال error generated negativity or error related negativity for the anterior cingulate cortex. ولكن برضه مهم جدا the role of the orbitofrontal cortex in assigning value to the stimulus. Okay? So that being said, نشوف هالاوربيتofrontal cortex هذه اللي يعني basically بتحكي لنا عنها انت قاعد and then actually you're telling us to kind of pay attention to. What's the difference between different species when it comes to the orbitofrontal cortex? Look at this. Look how small it is in the rat. Actually, I can tell you I spent a lot of my time actually playing with this cortex in the past years. Look at the squirrel monkey, the cat, the macaque monkey, the chimpanzee, the human, and the purpoise does not have مثلا an orbitofrontal cortex, or often the prefrontal cortex in this kind of context. Okay, so what does that tell you? Does size define function? ممكن حدا يجي يسألني طيب كيف بنعرف إنه هاي هي الاوربitofrontal أو prefrontal cortex that is in other mammals? Who knows the answer to this? مين بعرف كيف بنحدد cross species localization of brain areas? At least who can guess how we can do that? So it's basically based on anatomical localizations, and there are particular anatomical connections that define the connectivity of the particular area. إذا لقينا هذا الكلام في the brains of other members of the mammal kingdom, we can actually, or subkingdom, we can basically go ahead and say, oh, it looks like the prefrontal cortex. ولكن مثلا في in the rat, we don't call it prefrontal cortex, we call it prelimbic and infralimbic cortex. Okay, so that's actually how it is termed. مثل ما انتم شايفين, what really distinguishes the human مقارنة في المخلوقات الثانية?
The size.
The size? Is it the size?
Oh.
Or basically the size in comparison to the rest of the brain?
Proportional.
لأنه if I want to look into the elephant, they have a prefrontal cortex. It's much larger than the humans. ولكن the proportion of the prefrontal cortex to the rest of the cortex. Okay, so basically let's look at this. This is the prefrontal cortex according to Brodmann, and then as you can see here, the human is, basically the prefrontal cortex area is much larger than everybody else, but it's, it's like 100 times larger in this kind of context. All right, مقارنة ب the proportion of the prefrontal cortex area to the hemispheric cortex volume. So this is for the neocortex area, okay, and this is for the hemispheric cortex volume. And actually, with recent studies, it was shown that if you kind of correct for other kind of metrics that are related to the volume of the the different parts of the brain, not just the cortex and the neocortex, you can tell actually that basically, yes, humans are the next line of basically intelligence that could develop based on the size of the prefrontal cortex as such. And then ultimately, that actually means that there is some form of interesting functional continuity along the the axis of the mammals. في بعض الناس بيسموها تطور، في بعض الناس بيسموها خلق. Basically we don't want to get into this discussion. Then it becomes a really very kind of sour way of talking about things. وفي ناس بيقول لك انت بتحكي عن التطور لانك انت بتنفي وجود الخالق من الكلام. You believe whatever you want, guys. When it comes to science, it's all about evidence. Okay. العلم مش ضد الإيمان. Alright, مش ضد العلم والدين مش ضد بعض. They have different aspects of seeing things and actually explaining things, and nobody knows the truth. So that's actually really important. لأنه if you're saying I am a follower of the, by the way, let me tell you something. Another thing, نظرية داروين للتطور does not say that the human comes from the monkey. It does not say that. Alright, بس للتصحيح خطأ تاريخي. Actually what happened is the religious authorities kind of made him stick with that, in a sense that actually ultimately kind of to mud his reputation as an individual. He didn't say that. If you read his work, you will see that actually he didn't say that. He was talking about natural selection, which is a process that actually does not contradict with anything related to intelligent design. So something to consider and think about. And then ultimately just shows us that there is versatile functionality ودورنا نفهم, to try to look for this evidence and not to believe theories. These are theories. Okay. الدين بيفسر الموضوع بطريقة مختلفة إنه في عنا مسلمات هنا. Okay. No questions asked. So you cannot ask questions. خلاص انخلق هذا الموضوع هذا مخلوق. Fine. ولكن لا ينفي إنه نحاول نفهم كيف وشو اللي بصير. All right. That's my take on this. And again, I don't want to get into this discussion at this point. I know a lot of people said a lot of things in the past, and you can look them up. All right. So بناء على هذا الكلام, we would imagine بناء على إنه orbital frontal cortex, ventromedial prefrontal cortex is going to basically tell us what's the value of the stimulus. It has to be connected to a lot of things. Okay. يعني anything that actually would convey sensory information needs to talk to the prefrontal cortex. Is that the case? Absolutely. Someone can من sensory, primary sensory cortex, من visual cortex, من auditory cortex, من راح نشوف كمان شوي insula that actually gathers information from the periphery, viscera, من parietal cortex, different parts of the prefrontal cortex as well. Olfactory, all of this. And then ultimately, زي ما انتم شايفين, it has not just with the cortices, with the sensory component. مثل ما حكينا جمال, it talks to the medial temporal lobe, hippocampus, amygdala, entorhinal cortex, to ask, did you see this before? Okay, what does this mean? Does it have a danger effect to it? Okay, and then ultimately, we're talking about things that are effectors, مثلا thalamus and basal ganglia, pyramids, and so on and so forth. All right. And طبعا حسب categorization of which prefrontal cortex we're talking about the lateral, ventromedial, and we can look at the shared regions of connectivity. راح نشوف شو الفرق بين ventromedial, orbitofrontal cortices and lateral in a second. ولكن احنا هلا بنحكي على stimulus. ذكروا stimulus value, and this is actually why it's really important. كمان مرة, this is actually a posterior view of the brain. You can see the Brodmann areas that are related to this, and how close it is actually to, again, the orbits posteriorly. And ultimately, we're talking about what does the stimulus mean to you? What is the subjective value? And basically, again, going back to the question that Tuqa was asking, look at this. This is a difference between the nigrostriatal pathway. حكينا عن هذا الكلام في المحاضرات السابقة. From the nigra to the striatum, and the mesolimbic, mesocortical. Mesolimbic معناته It goes from the VTA to the limbic lobe, limbic cortex, and the amygdala, okay? And the mesocortical goes from the VTA to the different cortical regions, all right? Or mesolimbic طبعا goes to the nucleus accumbens as well. And the whole concept of reward prediction error, we discussed that as well, and we discussed the work of Wolfram Schultz. And that kind of leads us to the discussion of what is called the common currency theory. Common currency for what? Common currency for stimuli, all right? And then ultimately, how can we assign value or credits that actually would identify different stimuli based on the reward or punishment that is associated with it. ممكن حدا يجي يحكي لي طيب how can we know إذا الستيمولس أول مرة بشوفه? What do you need in order to assess the value of the stimulus?
Our personal preferences,
Initial
ممكن أو experiences.
could be random, could be
أو
completely
random.
If I see again a piece of fruit that looks nice and I eat it and I get poisoned, then I have no idea. It looks nice, the color is beautiful, and the taste is fantastic. But then when I ate it, I got sick. Then initially it's just random selection based on some previous experiences or just random. So ultimately, based on this punisher that I got, you know, when you eat this, you'll get sick. What do I do next if I see this fruit? What do you think?
I will not eat.
I'll avoid it. The response
حتى
is
لو حدا قال لي إنها منيحة.
exactly. So my personal experience says that actually based on trying, okay, based on exposure, that the credit assignment is negative to this. طيب كيف ممكن ندرس هذا aspect of the value? Look at this. This is actually called a devaluation task, reinforcer devaluation. How does it work? As you can see here, we place two objects in front of the monkey. The task is to pull these objects together. قربهم مع بعض. If the monkey does that, we provide them with cherries. And then ultimately we keep repeating this until they learn. Stimulus, response, outcome. Reinforcer, positive. All right. The negative component, if they don't do that, is they get nothing. So we have a positive or nothing for this particular type of trial. بعدين نعطيهم another set of shapes that actually, again, what they need to do here is, again, to pull them together in this sense. And basically, as you can see, what does it mean to pull them together? It means that you want to get one closer to the other. You know, usually they take one object and move it next to the other. Okay? يعني مثلا هون احنا بنحكي على the green cylinder. The green cylinder is moved closer to the yellow pyramid. But ultimately, we tried this with a blue cube and a half an elliptical, a yellow half an elliptical, or actually an orange one, if the color is correct. And then ultimately they need to move the blue cube closer. And what we offer them here is a different type of reward. We offer them peanuts, okay? And in a sense, we keep training them until they master it. But then شو بنعمل? How do we devalue something? How do you want to devalue a particular response or a particular association? You satiate the monkey. يعني لو نفترض إنه I tried this, and then طبعا provided that they don't have a preference للcherry or the peanuts. So ultimately we keep feeding the monkey peanuts open access until they حد ما يشبع the monkey. Then what do we do? We present them with this. We present them with the blue cube from the second trial and the yellow pyramid. هذا بما إنهم they're satiated or they're sated with the peanuts. What do you think? Which one should they select to move? Is it the blue cube or the yellow pyramid? أكلوا تشبعوا peanuts. What do you think? لو كنتوا مكانهم, what would you do? We do this.
The pyramid.
Pyramid.
You'll move them. Why?
Because it's something different than الإشي اللي له السنة باكله.
لأنهم
شبع
haven't
من
yet
البينتس بده
exactly
ياخد
شبع من
cherries.
البينتس بس ما شبع من الcherries لسه. فبالتالي the cherry has basically, or let's call it the yellow pyramid has more value. إذن الvalue مش بس reward or punishment. الvalue, how much of that did I obtain? All right. So it's more of a credit. And we did two things here. We showed that ultimately the value is like an account. You fill it or empty it. If it's not very full, you can still fill inside of it, say cherry component. If it's completely full, it becomes less exciting, less of a value. You have access to it. All right. مين اللي بيعمل هذا الكلام كمان مرة؟ Orbitofrontal cortex and ventromedial prefrontal cortex. Got it? Okay, let me cover the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and then we'll take a break, and then we'll resume the lecture after. حكينا عن stimulus so far. كل الحكي كان عن the value of the stimulus and how, you know, different parts of the sensory network or the sensory cortical areas basically take the, you know, basically correspond with the prefrontal cortex and the orbitofrontal cortex in order to pass the sensory stimulus aspect of things, and then ultimately decide on does it actually infer a positive value, a negative value, based on discussion between the cortex and subcortical areas to know, was there a value assigned to this before? Is it associated with fearful stimulus? Is it associated with a reward? Is it associated with punishment? To subsequently make a response. طب هذا response, if I haven't or I hadn't seen that stimulus before, how is it formed? أعطيكم مثال. لما حكينا عن classical conditioning كنا نحكي عن conditioned stimulus, unconditioned stimulus association, وبعدين بنسميه unconditioned response. مظبوط؟ alright. امتى بصير اسمه conditioned response؟ ذكروني. When does the unconditioned response gets converted, or when does it get converted into conditioned response? مين بتذكر؟
لما نشيل ال unconditioned stimulus.
Excellent. لما نشيل unconditioned stimulus بصير عندنا response regardless of the unconditioned stimulus. Thank you. Precisely. إذن بصير اسمه conditioned response. And then ultimately, apparently, the network of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex supports this beautifully. مقارنة في الcondition classical conditioning نشوف الانسترومنتال stimulus, response, and outcome. Stimulus, response, and outcome. I keep repeating this until every time I see the stimulus, I do the response without getting the outcome. Not necessarily getting the outcome. Some habit learning. Stimulus, response, without the response outcome association. Very similar to what we'll see in a second. As you can see here, input 1, 2, 3, different parts of the stimulus. Again, the value aspect of it, the sensory aspect of it, the approach avoidance aspect of it. Then, as you can see, it goes to the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Then from there, it goes to the output. With training, this becomes less active and it goes directly من الانبوتس للoutputs. You see? هنا كان عندنا CS, US, and UR. مع the training صار عندي CS, no US, no need for the US, immediately to, you know, the CR. And here we're talking stimulus, and the response is already calculated here, and it goes directly to the outcome. So في عندنا two modes of calculating the response here. One is called model based, okay, بسموها model based أو goal directed behavior, أو habitual learning. Okay, واضحة هاي النقطة يا جماعة؟ مهمة جدا، لأنه ultimately هذا هو اللي يعني بينتج الautomaticity in terms of responding later with training. كمان مرة تذكروا, how do you input the password for your phone? Do you even think about it? افترضوا انكم غيرتوا الباسورد هذه. You will need to go slowly, think about it and wait. شو الريورد تبعكم؟ شو الاوتبوت تبعكم؟ Does the phone open or not? Okay. And based on this, as you can see, this is actually, the monkey is being trained on a delayed response task. If they fixate on a central spot, and then ultimately you want them to remember which one of the positions they had remembered, and this is, we're currently recording as well, of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex neurons. And as you can see, يعني مثلا هنا the fixation كانت toward, you know, the 135 degrees, as you can see here in particular. Okay, عفوا, the fixation is in the middle عفوا, and then the stimulus is appearing in that particular quadrant, اللي هو the you know, negative x positive y quadrant. You will basically see some form of activity في dorsolateral prefrontal cortex that actually is going to be toward that stimulus, you know, the response component. So the response component is going to be supported by the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, neurons firing in response to that particular stimulus appearing in that quadrant. With training, it becomes much more fine-tuned, and then ultimately you see this in a subset of neurons, not all of the neurons. All right? And you can see the selectivity here of where the neurons fire with the presentation of the stimulus, not anywhere else. Okay? And again, it denotes a particular response that they need to gaze in that direction, what we call saccade. All right? That's a part we didn't discuss basically when it comes to that. Well, I can ultimately we'll see what that actually entails. And then ultimately it's thought of as encoding a rule. What does a rule mean here? Rule means if you see a particular set of stimuli, this is the action that you want to take. Okay? And then ultimately this becomes more of the what we call generalization. في تعاون بيكون بين dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the internal cortex and the hippocampus. And then ultimately, let's take a look at this matching task. So basically what you see here is you expose the, you know, basically here the individual or the monkey in this kind of case to a cue, and it's associated with you know, it's associated with a juice reward. And then after a delay, they want to match, you know, that cue with the similar cue. So this is the response that you want. All right. And then ultimately, if they do this particular response, you give them another reward here, and then you give another delay and you do another test. So we're trying to match. Okay. The rule is all about matching the object with basically similar objects. Okay. And then ultimately, based on this, what you want is the similarity component of things. It's either similar or not similar. And in this case, basically, it ceases here if they select the same object, or it continues to subsequent things until they select the similar object. If it's a non-matching rule, okay, they need to match the incongruent component, and basically maybe you can associate it with a high tone here, and then as such, you know, you associate the cue with a high tone, or here زي ما شفتوا انتوا we associate the cue with a juice reward, classical conditioning, and then ultimately based on that, if the individual, or again the animal here, matches with the incongruent cue, the example stops there. If it matches with a congruent cue, it gives another delay, and then actually until the subject matches with the incongruent cue. إذن ليش هذا الكلام مهم؟ يعني when we record the activity of dorsolateral prefrontal cortex in this kind of sense, we see particular selectivity, okay? Particular selectivity for object A and object B in this sense, okay? And ultimately, it's just depending on which kind of rule are we following, all right? So the firing of, you know, these particular neurons is modulated is modulated by the difference in the rule that is being followed in order to match these different responses. Okay? All right. It has been shown that as well here that actually it's really important for the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex to function in the context of working memory. One example on this is what's called the Wisconsin card sorting task. And then ultimately the Wisconsin card sorting task is basically something that is very similar to this, to the matching and non-matching rule, you know. And then basically, as you can see here, you want to look for congruent or incongruent, you know, sets of cards, and then ultimately just put them in categories, put the cards in categories in order to, you know, produce significant sets in this kind of regard. Okay, Jama'ah. So let's stop here for a second, and then we'll resume in 10 minutes. Any questions before we stop? Okay. So basically, that being said, we'll be back here in 10 minutes. So let's be here. كم الوقت عندكم هلا انتم المفروض 2:05 او 3:05 مظبوط عفوا 2:57 او 3:57 depending on where you are في القارة اللي اسمها فلسطين تبعتنا basically. So يعني في فرق وقت عندنا. Let's come back in like 5 minutes after the you know the beginning of the hour. We'll see you in a bit. Okay, guys, let's resume. Any questions before we go back to the lecture? Please feel free to ask. It's much easier to answer these questions within the context of the lecture, as opposed to when you ask about them later. When المعلومات بعدها fresh, and it's easier to associate them with each other. Okay, so basically إذا حكينا بشكل مختصر عن the evaluation of the stimulus, the assessment and the decision related to the response. بس بعدين, how do we think, again, think between brackets, about the outcome? What gives us the value of the outcome? How does the brain assess the value of the outcome of our responses? And ممكن حدا يجي يسألني طيب مثل سؤال اللي سألته تيمة قبل شوي basically, or actually the comment that تيمة made. طب أنا إذا شغلة بشوفها أول مرة, how can I even evaluate the outcome here? إذن هنا the whole idea behind this is trial and error. Trial and error. And ultimately this is a very important message. If our brain is learning this way, we need to understand that a lot of things are not going to work for the first time. لأنه our brains are designed in a way that actually makes them better at repetition. Okay, so that's a secondary message to you guys, saying that if you want to do better in terms of studying, you need to actually kind of leave time for repeating materials. If you want to do better in terms of acquiring a skill, you need to continuously repeat it. And there's actually, mean better, how many hours do you need to spend doing something to be called an expert? Any ideas? How many hours?
10,000 بالعادة بيحكوا.
Usually 10,000. Exactly. So we're talking about the 10,000 hour rule. ذكروا, you want to become a professional violinist, you need to play the violin for 10,000 hours before you're called an expert, or a orchestra violinist, or a pianist, or something like this. طيب ممتاز. إذا احنا بنحكي على outcome. What monitors the outcome عشان يخلينا نعمل أحسن المرة القادمة? By the way, just a relevant discussion. That's actually the concept that ChatGPT uses in order to improve its performance. شو اللي عملوا الناس؟ عملوا شيء بيسموه large language model, LLM. LLM هذا based on an idea that Google came up with, اسمها transformers. بتحول التكست ل mathematical vectors, and then ultimately it matches whatever you ask it with. It converts it to another mathematical vector. بتشوف أقرب شيء على أي جزء من التكست الموجود عندها في الذاكرة. جزء سمعته 170 billion parameters, 500 billion parameters, and so on and so forth. هذا حجم التكست اللي ChatGPT actually relies on, or something like Google Bard or Meta Llama, هاي المودلز. And then ultimately بندرب الموديل هذا. كيف ندربه؟ basically بتسأله سؤال للموديل بحكي لك هاي الجواب بناء على mathematical aspect of similarity, okay? And then ultimately based on this you say correct or incorrect based on your domain knowledge. If it's incorrect, هاي شايفين كيف نعمل assessment للoutcome. الموديل it goes back and looks somewhere else or somewhere close. وممكن يكون هذا كلام it actually tells you كمان مرة it's not absolute. ممكن 0 أو 1. It's not you get fully rewarded or fully punished. Okay. كمان مرة النقطة اللي basically أحمد كان يسأل عنها. There are no absolutes in life most of the time, I would say, actually, except maybe for death. It's an absolute. That's what we know, actually, at least. So that's actually something. فبناء على هذا الكلام, which part of the brain does that? It's called the cingulate cortex. ذكروا من المحاضرة امبارح, cingulate cortex is part of what we call the limbic lobe. Where is it situated? It's basically in this kind of groove inside the brain, okay? And then ultimately, another reason to think about the design here, or basically how it came to be, it's anything that is inside is for very important protection. And that actually shows you why potentially could be really important anatomically and functionally. So in a sense, the anterior cingulate cortex is important for what we call error-related negativity. When you commit an error, كيف نعرف إن we committed an error؟ كيف تعرفوا إنكم غلطتوا في الامتحان تبع النيوروفيزيولوجي 2؟ إن شاء الله إنكم ما تغلطوش بس.
scientific ولا
result.
Exactly. The outcome. It's some of the questions I might be asking, you might say, oh, بتخوض علينا الدكتور يعني شو الأسئلة هذه basically. But I want you to think about the basics. لأنه if you think about the basics, then you can actually understand more complex things. تحفظوش يا جماعة. Don't memorize these particular aspects of things. Break them down. Think of it as Lego. You know, you're playing Lego, all right? And you try to construct something. So that's the idea here. إذا أنا بعرف إني عملت غلط by the negative outcome. Negative outcome could be a bad mark. A negative outcome could be somebody telling me don't do that. Okay, the negative outcome could be burning. مثلا إذا أنا قربت إيدي على شيء سخن مثلا. All right, this is for the younger kids. And as such, what really processes this in the brain? It is what is called the anterior cingulate cortex. It relates to error-related negativity. And this is actually a construct that has been observed in the EEG in particular, a particular wave that we actually look at in this kind of context. طب كيف ممكن نعرف دور ال anterior cingulate cortex in this particular aspect of things? We use something called the Stroop effect. Okay, the Stroop effect. Actually, let me see. Let's play the Stroop effect. Let me actually try to locate it here on my computer. And then I want somebody to volunteer. And we'll play the Stroop. Let me see here. Where is the Stroop? Okay. So in a sense, what I'm looking for here is an idea that would allow us to, to try to understand. Let me actually look it up very quickly, search for it. File, right? I'm sorry, I wanna just have you guys play this. I don't recall exactly where I put it. But it would allow you to know exactly. Basically what this entails. Yeah, I'm unable to find it, unfortunately, but يعني I'll try to convey the idea. في الستروب task, what do we do there? بنفرجي السبجكت basically بداية بنفرجيهم ألوان. Okay. دائرة أو مربع عليه لون نطلب منهم name the color. بعدين basically we show them the word for the color. Yellow, green, blue, red, etc., etc. Okay. And then ultimately we show them a congruent name of the basically of the color. يعني مثل ما شفتوا انتوا هنا, yellow is colored yellow, blue is colored blue. And then we show them incongruent aspects of the and color does not reflect the word, and neutral aspects, truck, that doesn't necessarily have a particular color. All right, and then we see how long it takes them until they commit a mistake. Okay, إذن نحكي لهم بس just tell us the basically here, read the word, or tell us the color. Basically tell us the color. I know the word is easy to read here. And then ultimately the color here is green, the color here is blue, the color here is red. Okay, and then ultimately what we want them to make is to be unable to distinguish the color from the written word and make an error. What was found is that the basically the lateral prefrontal cortex, which does what? اتفقنا قبل شوي. شو بتعمل lateral prefrontal cortex? The lateral prefrontal cortex is important for what, Jama?
Encoding maintenance of rules. Dorsolateral.
Lateral prefrontal cortex is important for rules. For what?
Encoding them so that you can follow them بعدين.
To do what? To do a response. مظبوط?
Oh.
We're talking about the response. ذكروا stimulus, orbital frontal ventromedial, response, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and now we're talking outcome is anterior cingulate cortex. إذا شفنا بناء على هذا الكلام activity في lateral prefrontal cortex, the current trial, you will see some form of basically a dip in the activity. Okay, and ultimately this dip in the activity of the lateral prefrontal cortex significantly associates with basically the activity of the anterior cingulate cortex in the previous trial. So the higher the activity of the anterior cingulate cortex, okay, the higher the activity in that particular part of the lateral prefrontal cortex to tell it which response should you consolidate. Okay, so كأنها the effect that is in the previous trial is telling us what to do on this trial. The outcome that we observed in the previous trial through the anterior cingulate cortex is modulating our ability to make a response in this trial by the modulation of the anterior cingulate cortex of the dorsolateral or the lateral prefrontal cortex. Got it? So this is how we think about this, in a sense. And then ultimately, it becomes really important in the context of a lot of psychiatric disorders to evaluate outcomes, especially the negative ones. حكينا امبارح عن شيء بنسميه impulsivity. مين بتذكر شو يعني impulsivity اللي حكينا عنها امبارح او بده يعرف لنا اياها؟ What does it mean to be impulsive?
Reacting without like rational thinking.
Rational thinking in the context of what, Taima?
Consequences.
Negative consequences in particular. Okay, so negative consequences in particular. And then ultimately the same applies to compulsion. That's basically the compulsion has the form of cyclicity to it. Okay, you know, it keeps recurring. جماعة بدنا حدا غير تيمة يشارك يعني تيمة appreciate your input here and continue to do that please. بس ما لنا شو صاير لنا اليوم. You used to be more active. Okay, anyways, so basically in this kind of sense, we care a lot about what evaluates the outcome, the negative outcome in particular, in the context of obsessive compulsive disorder. سمعتوا فيها الديسوردر هذه؟ شو بميز البيشنتس اللي بيجوا obsessive compulsive disorder عند حدا غير تيمة رجاء. إذا ما حدش حكى تيمة, you please be my guest. What happens in OCD? I hear it a lot that actually people joke like to each other, medical students say, oh, you're a little bit OCD. What does it mean? تيمة تفضلي.
دكتور
تفضل. Go ahead.
obsession يعني هو recurrent stimuli ضل موجود. الكومبالسيف انك انت ما يعني بتضلك بتعمل رياكشن او لهذا الاستيمولاي، بتضلك تعمل اوتبوت ما بتاكد انه خلص.
ممتاز جمال. اذا بفرق لنا بين الاوبسيشنز والكومبulsions. شو الفرق بينهم يا جماعه؟ Let's think about it.
الاوبسيشن هو الشعور في انك انت لازم تسوي شيء.
So جمال بحكي لنا الاوبسيشن هو عباره عن الشعور في اني لازم اسوي شيء. طب الكومبulsion؟
انك تضلك تسوي هذا الشيء.
اذا it's basically about the thought. The obsession is a thought of continuously thinking about something that could hurt you, all right, in a sense. And the compulsion is actually doing it, all right, continuously doing that particular aspect of the action that you're talking about. شو في examples بتشوفوهم عند الناس اللي عندهم OCD؟
ممكن زي في ناس they believe إنه زي لازم مثلا يكبسوا كبسة 25 مرة، أو زي في مرات ناس في عندهم رقم محدد ولا مثلا their family dies or something، أو في مثلا contamination OCD where they believe إنه زي there's bacteria or viruses on every surface وبصفوا لازم إنه زي clean it or not touch anything لما يمسكوا هذا الشيء.
A lot of examples. Absolutely. Thank you, Taima. Precisely. And then ultimately, يعني, the patients بتشوفوهم عادة for some reason a lot of them, they come with skin erosions من قد ما بيغسلوا because of the contamination obsession and contamination compulsion. So بتطلع على ايديهم, they're very reddish and eroded basically. And ultimately you see one of these things. في بعض الناس لازم يضل يلف في دائرة around themselves, okay, continuously زي ما حكت, in order for something negative, to avoid something negative to happen. All right? And they don't care about the negative that happens to them in this kind of context. The harm that happens to them. إذا في عندنا مشكلة في evaluation potentially. طبعا في عندنا مشكلة في circuit that actually leads to this habit formation, if I may call it a habit or obsession or compulsion. لأنه احنا كنا نحكي على closed circuit here that keeps recurring. Sounds familiar? شو الشغلة اللي حكينا عنها سابقا supports the the emergence of such a functionality? حدا بيضل يعمل physical action and they're thinking about something at the same time. What does that sound like? You should know that. Corticostriatal circuits, corticostriatal loops. Actually, it's quite interesting here because patients with OCD could undergo either cingulotomies or DBS to the basal ganglia to fix these problems. All right, so that just tells you a little bit more about the circuitry. So in a sense, that what we do there is basically drill a hole in the anterior cingulate cortex to take part of it out, or we could insert a stimulating electrode and do DBS. And actually this DBS significantly decreases the obsessions and potentially the compulsions actually. Okay, so take a look at this, the psycho-surgical treatments. It has an interesting history, and pre-50s, it was very common with the lobotomies in particular. And actually Igaz Moniz got the Nobel Prize for that. And then ultimately in later subsequent decades, it became a very big problem actually. Like people like ghosts walking around. And that ultimately showed the significant problem that this particular treatment could cause. Taima, تفضلي.
But lobotomies are no longer like acceptable treatments, huh?
Absolutely, not anymore. That's, he got the Nobel Prize for it, basically. That's one, so, but no, not any longer. I know they cause a huge amount of damage, and then ultimately you just go inside there and burn an area, becomes completely dysfunctional. For now, we do less intrusive kind of approaches. We do DBS, just insert an electrode. You cause a little bit of damage, but not a lot of damage. We still take parts of the brain out, especially when it comes to epilepsy, all right? But mostly it's significantly more controlled in this kind of sense, okay? حاليا actually there are some really intriguing other types of treatments. في شيء بسموه TDCS, transcranial direct current stimulation, or TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation. You don't need to do any surgeries. You just put a coil around the head and then ultimately start stimulating. And you can infer a lot of functionalities based on that without needing to do any kind of surgical interventions.
Have the shock therapy?
Shock therapy is called ECT, electroconvulsive therapy. That's a different type of therapy. EDCS is a very small amount of current, okay? But ECT is a significant amount of current, okay?
Is it still an option?
للناس اللي عندهم suicidal attempts, okay, it significantly improves suicidality. People with psychosis in particular, it's another treatment. But طبعا it's a last resort mostly. It causes a lot of damage in the brain, okay? Remember that it's still used, unfortunately. But طبعا with different variants. You need to the patient mostly needs to be anesthetized as well because it's very painful, all right? بس هون بنحكي عنه very mild amounts of current. You don't even feel it, And the magnetic stimulation is magnetic stimulation. You don't feel anything there. Okay? All right. So now what we want to think about is something else, which is basically, we talked about the stimulus, we talked about the response, we talked about the outcome. stimulus response outcome. مين بده يعد لي شو المناطق اللي modulates each one of them؟ stimulus شو اللي بيعدل لنا اياها او بيعملنا identification of value for the stimulus.
Orbital prefrontal cortex
and ventromedial prefrontal cortex. What about the response?
dorsolateral
Prefrontal cortex. What about the outcome?
cingulate.
Anterior cingulate in particular. Posterior cingulate does something else. We'll talk about it by the end of the lecture. But if I want to modify that, modify these rules between the stimulus and the response and the outcome, what happens? شو مهمة هاي المنطقة في الدماغ؟ وشو اللي بيلزم يكون في الكونكتيفيتي تبعتها مشان تعمل هذا الشغل؟ Apparently, as you would tell, it has to connect to all of the three, to the stimulus evaluation, to the response assessment, and to the outcome evaluation. All right? وهي المنطقة بنسميها ventrolateral prefrontal cortex. Okay, it could override the functionalities and reassess, in a sense. Okay? So basically, that's what we call flexibility. This defines what we call cognitive flexibility. All right? لأنه بيكون عندنا something that we're used to, and we want to break that habit. We want to get to the point where, you know, we could say, no, this is not working. Let me just reconsider, in a sense. Okay? Let's take an example here. If basically you you take a training phase and you associate faces, particular faces with particular pictures. Okay? And then we train the subjects over multiple trials. And then we want to think, we present the faces that the subject was trained on, and we ask them to think of what was the associated picture. All right? And ultimately, we repeat this again 12 times. But also in the experimental phase, what we do is we ask them not to think, in a sense. Okay? And so basically, the second condition is we divide these faces into think or not think. And in the think component, they'll need to be able to retrieve that picture. In the not think component, we don't want to let them think about, the picture that was associated with this particular face. And then ultimately, what we want to do at the very end of the experiment is to ask them to report. Did we actually change the association between that picture, the face, and the picture that was presented? And when people go through this experiment inside the functional MRI, the most pronounced activity is basically seen in the inferior frontal gyrus, and it's actually a major component of what we call the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, especially for the no think component. Okay, so when you ask them to inhibit their thought, what you see is a significant activity in the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, and as such, you can see actually here basically the inferior frontal component right here, actually, okay, in the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, and as such, you would tell that actually this area potentially is involved in the in the modification or behavioral inhibition of what happens based on previously stored information as a stimulus response outcome. Okay, so that's in a nutshell what the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex is important for, and in a sense that actually is what is considered to be a behavioral inhibition. Okay, behavioral inhibition signal, in a sense. All right, and that allows you to do something that is called self-control. All right. إذا هنا بحكي أنا مش stimulus response outcome. If I want to stop this, the training that was already happening, how can I do that? I do that using the circuitry that is called the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex. Okay. ذكروا امبارح في النقاش عن emotions. When we talked about anxiety, where does anxiety start? Does it start centrally or
peripherally.
ممتاز, exactly, Jamal. So most of the time it starts peripherally by peripheral function, and that peripheral function gets conveyed to the brain. But where in the brain? حكينا على الأميجدلا احنا, but actually it does not really communicate immediately with the amygdala. What do you think, Jamal?
عن طريق reticular formation في ascending pathways.
Reticular formation does not necessarily communicate back with the amygdala. بدك إشي يجي على integrator in the brain, and this integrator says, oh, something is happening in the periphery. Okay? And then ultimately, based on this integrator, it projects down to the amygdala. شو قلنا الميجر input للأميجدلا؟ BLA تذكروا؟ حدا منكم جاوب امبارح. What is the major input to the amygdala? Anterior insula, precisely. إذا الانterior insula بناء على هاي الcircuitry apparently collects information from the periphery, integrates it, and distributes it to the different parts of the cortex or different parts of basically the subcortex when we're talking about the amygdala in this kind of sense. So as such, it's considered an integrator of the internal milieu, all right, or an integrator of somatic markers, as we call them. And basically sometimes الواحد ممكن ياكل شغلة سيئة, okay, and then بيصير بطنه يوجعه, all right, and this particular feeling makes you anxious. كمان مرة enteric nervous system communicates back basically with the anterior insula, and the anterior insula kind of distributes this information to the amygdala, to the anterior cingulate cortex, to the prefrontal cortex. And how can we basically assess that? You know, assess the ability of you know, what is it called, the insula, in terms of being able to reflect this this kind of behavior in a sense. And actually the Iowa gambling task is mostly related to the function of the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, لأنه احنا بنحكي عن basically what we're talking about is more of the valuation of the you know, of the stimulus, ولكن we associate it with a peripheral shock in this kind of context. Okay, so usually how do you know advantageous versus disadvantageous choice? The disadvantageous choice is not associated with shock. The advantageous choice and the disadvantageous choice is associated with a shock. So هنا the Iowa gambling task is basically you have 4 decks of cards and you want to select one of them, and based on this, if I can advantageous deck of cards, you get nothing. Basically you're you know you're safe from getting a shock. If it's a disadvantageous choice, you get shocked peripherally in the finger or in the hand, and then ultimately it shows you that we're doing a peripheral negative outcome. And then it needs to be integrated and carried to the brain. Interestingly enough, actually, this was tested in 2 populations of patients. This was tested with patients with ventromedial prefrontal cortex lesions and in patients with anterior insular regions or lesions. ننسى الانسولا شوي. شو تتوقعوا بصير في الventromedial prefrontal cortex patients? If they don't have the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, what functionality will they lose in a sense?
Self-control.
Personality, حكينا self-control, but based on what we explained. If we don't have VMPFC, what do we lose in our ability to assess these stimuli?
السبريشن تبعت الأميجدلا، بس مش هي الوحيدة اللي بتعمل سبريشن للأميجدلا.
Not exactly related to the amygdala, but think of it as like, how can what do I lose about the processing of the information? Come on, نرجع stimulus response outcome. What do we lose if we lose the VMPFC? I just said that, guys.
No, attention, working memory, manipulating.
بنتحذر زي ما احنا basically. So VMPFC, OFC, VMPFC شو دورهم كمان مرة؟ So we said that actually the role of the VMPFC and the orbitofrontal cortex is valuation of the stimulus. إذا أنا شفت الكارد that I got shocked if I selected from it, مش راح أقدر أعمل integration. I cannot update the value of it if I lose the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and the orbitofrontal cortex.
فراح أنقيه كمان مرة. إذا ما عندي.
I'm gonna get shocked again. Okay. And then ultimately based on that, I'll make much more errors in the disadvantageous choices than the advantageous choices, right? Because I cannot update this in a sense. المفروض يكون في normal subjects, you identify the disadvantage and then actually just avoid it. But if you make more errors, this means that you cannot update the information there in a sense, okay? And that's much more pronounced for the negative component اللي هو shock, لأنه هنا shock related. All right? هنا basically it's you either put it as a reward or nothing in the advantageous component. And that's actually why you see this not changing. So based on that, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex is important for us to update the value of the stimulus. We don't have it anymore. طيب ليش الانterior insula مهمة هنا؟ لأنه if I don't have the anterior insula, I cannot integrate the shock that is coming from the periphery with the value. You see the point? And that's actually what's really important. If I don't have the insula, the patients with insular lesions, they will do exactly like ventromedial prefrontal cortex lesions. ليش؟ لأنه الانسula هي اللي بتوصل المعلومات لل VMPFC من ال periphery. If I don't have it, I cannot do that. Is it all bad? There is nothing all bad or all good when it comes to our limited life in this capacity. زي ما انتم شايفين هون, this is a really intriguing experiment. Patients with insular damage had no problems quitting smoking. شو المشكلة في quitting? شو المشكلة في drug abuse in general or في dependence على الكافيين ولا على النيكوتين ولا على السكر? What is the problem? إذا أنا بدي أترك السكر ولا بدي أترك النيكوتين ولا بدي أترك الكافيين or other drugs, alcohol and drugs of abuse.
إنه مرات we prefer immediate reward تبع الإشي وما بنفكر في consequences تبعه.
هذا at a more advanced level of thinking. بس شو المشكلة؟ ليش الناس اللي بيفكروش في موضوع cravings, thank you, withdrawal symptoms, وجع الراس اللي بصيبني إذا ما شربتش القهوة الصبح, okay, التعب العام الماليز اللي بصيبني إذا ما if I don't smoke my cigarettes. طب بناء على هذا الكلام, الناس اللي عندهم insular damage, can they feel the peripheral withdrawal syndrome? What do you think?
لا أنا مش راح يتوصل من البريفرال.
Precisely. فما في عندي any integrator that would actually take all of these peripheral signals and put them in the brain and actually kind of have them talk to the rest of the brain to feel anxious and to feel tired and to feel the withdrawal symptoms. You see? So that's an advantage. كمان مرة, it's not a black or white when it comes to things that happen to you in life. حتى disorders, حتى the problems. Okay, that being said, what we're talking about here is the ability of the insula to integrate information. And, excuse me, people who actually had damage to the insula had no problem quitting smoking or quitting anything else, basically, لأنه they cannot integrate the withdrawal symptoms. Okay, خليني أعيد كمان مرة. Ventromedial prefrontal cortex, orbitofrontal cortex is important for stimulus valuation. Dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is important for response modulation and response decision and ultimately rule formation. The anterior cingulate cortex is related to what we call error-related negativity, the outcome component. The ventrolateral prefrontal cortex is important for behavioral inhibition, stopping the stimulus response outcome chain and training on something new, potentially. The anterior insula is extremely important for integrating peripheral information, somatic markers into the stimulus response outcome chain or the conditioned, unconditioned end response chain. So far.
دكتور
تفضل.
إذا صار ليجن في الفنترولاترال يعني الشخص صار عنده هابت بعد ما صار الليجن ما بقدرش يغيرهن خلاص.
يكون صعب جدا تغيرهم exactly لأنك you lost your behavioral inhibition.
يعني ظل مبرمج.
Not stop. You see?
تمام.
It's like a stop sign. It's like وقف. Stop there. Let's think about what you're doing. They can't do that. All right.
Okay.
So they cannot form potentially. They cannot form new habits. All right. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Great question, Jamal. And then ultimately, بنحكي عن another component of the network اسمه posterior cingulate cortex. حكينا anterior cingulate cortex. Don't lump them together. Very different connectivities. Okay. The posterior cingulate cortex is extremely important for what we call self-awareness. Honestly, I have no idea what this means. Actually, free will and self-awareness, and ultimately, consciousness, and is just it becomes really difficult to kind of put words on that. But a lot of people like to think in this kind of social neuroscience or social cognitive neuroscience component of things. And what does it mean to have faith? What does it mean to lie? Honestly, I don't know like how this works. Honestly, I do really disagree with a lot of these constructs that are being that are being formed here. شو يعني somebody who is a psychopath? شو يعني somebody without empathy? How can you define that? Honestly, I don't know. Okay. So don't ask me about my opinion here, because I can go on forever talking about the philosophy behind them, and then ultimately that becomes a problem, as you would tell. ولكن what would really be interesting to learn about the posterior cingulate cortex is its participation in what we call the default mode network. The default mode network. As the name implicates, there is a network in the brain that is almost always active. Diamond, it's always on for some reason, okay? And then regardless of it's, you're awake or you're asleep, or always, at least parts of it are always active. And apparently the posterior cingulate cortex is one of the main ones that are actually really important in this kind of context. Okay? So basically, as you can see here, this is the default mode function. And as you can see, the posterior cingulate cortex is always a very hot hub when it comes to these things. Okay? Interestingly enough, it's a default mode. Yani, its activity goes down if you're engaged in functions. So how do we acquire this information? We put people in the fMRI, and then we ask them to not think about anything. So when they're basically, sitting still there, not thinking, the brain is active. Much more active than when they're thinking, in a sense, which is quite fascinating, very counter intuitive in a sense. And your brains are more active when you're not thinking, if we measure that in terms of neuronal firing, by looking at what is called the default mode network. And a major hub in this is considered to be the posterior cingulate cortex. So a lot of people think of it as self-awareness. And again, I have my reasons to disagree with that. And then ultimately you're free to think whatever you want in this kind of regard. زي ما تشوفوا هنا, the firing rates significantly go down when you're engaged in attentional tasks or memory tasks في default mode network. Okay? Okay. تيمة تفضلي.
طب بالنسبة لزي في الإكسبيرمنت هاي لما قالوا لهم إنه not to think about anything، هل الإشي منطقي؟ إنه زي مثلا إذا أنا قلت لحدا إنه مثلا ما يفكرش بكاسة حمراء، الإشي الوحيد اللي راح يفكر فيه هو كاسة حمراء.
Well, absolutely. If you keep it basically as a focus point, and we have ways to do that. If you just put a fixating point in front of them, we have a screen inside the fMRI. عرفت كيف؟ The screen هنحطها through mirrors, and then ultimately you put goggles, and these goggles would reflect this kind of fixating point. But if you just ask them to basically fixate on a point in the nothingness with a gray color or a black color or a white color, then ultimately طبعا monotonous here, like there is no change. Trying to kind of consolidate this kind of nothingness of the ideas, of the thoughts, then potentially yes, you can. All right. And how do we check? Using subjective self-report. Did you actually do something or not? But I agree with you. There is no proper objective way to do that. You cannot gauge people's thoughts, in a sense. And actually, it was very funny. The other day, I was reading, actually a couple of months ago, Mark Zuckerberg and Meta people, they think that they can decode what you're thinking about by doing fMRI of people reading or listening to audiobooks. I mean, good luck, you know, basically, if that's what they want to do. You see, using machine learning and AI. So don't be scared of these things. راح يتجسسوا على أفكارنا. كيف؟ فهموني, basically. Look at this, you know.
دكتور
تفضل.
يعني البرين بيكون لسه اكتف يوم انا افكر.
لما انت تفكر في specific, a lot of the areas are less active. Then it's
ليش بيصير عندي فتيق ويصير يعني tired وهيدك من التفكير اذا انا بصير لسه active.
Basically, لأنك يعني basically you kind of consume the ability of that area to be less active. You see, kind of being less active in a sense. طبعا it's more of a generalized view. In a lot of very special things that we do, yes, there are areas that are much more active. Okay, but generally speaking, collective view على الدماغ هنا احنا بنحكي انه less active. ولكن realistically subsets of cells are more active وهذول هم اللي بيتعبوا. Okay.
تمام.
اما generally speaking لو طلع على كل الدماغ كميه انا بنفكر فيها من ناحيه physics من ناحيه كميه الانرجي that is being expended here, you spend much more energy by not thinking as opposed by thinking. All right, in this kind of sense, the default mode network kind of aspect of things. Okay, طبعا هذا الكلام is inferred, is not direct, it's indirect لانه نستعمل ال fMRI to measure شيء بنسميه the Bolt signal, the blood oxygenation level, and from it we infer firing rates of neurons.
طيب دكتور انا مش فاهم نقطه الفري ويلينج. اذا انا صار في ليجن في البوستيريور سينجوليت كورتكس شو التاثير يعني كيف يعني مش فيش عنده فري ويلينج يعني فيش عنده consciousness.
Well, basically it just shows كمان مرة define free will for me. What is free will? You know, the ability to make decisions on your own without being influenced by external sources. I don't know. And again, it's يعني it's inference, you know. It's basically it's not a direct measure of what we call free will. It's an experiment that does something that could represent free will. You see, Jamal? Honestly, I really would deviate from this. It's not really very scientific, if I may say. It's an interesting for like popular science kind of discussions, but for something for the dinner table or the iftar table, okay, basically, but it's very far from what actually the brain is doing. Can we pinpoint free will in the brain? I have no idea how that could actually even be possible. Can you do that across individuals? I don't know. We can't. Actually, now the answer is no, we can't. Can we do that in the future? If we use the same current tools that we're using right now? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. You know, I'm actually kind of sure about that. Yes, I like to kind of maintain a little bit of skepticism about my own, certainties that would allow us to make progress as humans. Okay. And entertain the idea of me trying to prove myself wrong, not right. على كل. So كمان مرة خلينا نراجع ال different ideas that were actually kind of we displayed here. Actually, one last point, I don't want to forget this. It's actually the posterior cingulate cortex is very important for what we call exploration. And again, no thoughts when it comes to exploration. You're just navigating and looking for cues and looking for stimuli and looking for targets. Okay, and the minute you pay attention to them or you try to remember, it goes down. All right, that's actually the activity in this particular sense. So take a look at this. ولكن in general, let's simplify this particular chapter. Stimulus, response, outcome. CS, US, response. So one can conditioned or unconditioned. When we're talking about the stimulus, again, what is the brain area that is in action here? Ventromedial prefrontal cortex, orbital frontal cortex. When we're talking about the response, which cortex is actually being activated there, we're talking about the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex for actions or rule formation or whatever you want to call it. When we're talking about the outcome assessment, especially the negative component, we're talking about the anterior cingulate cortex, especially for error-related negativity. When we're talking about the ability to do behavioral inhibition and stop a formed stimulus response outcome chain, we're talking about the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex for behavioral inhibition. When we are considering the peripheral environment and the peripheral input from different parts of the body and how that is integrated into the stimulus response outcome, so can muscle movement, will a shock, will a pain, will a reward, whatever you want to call it, then this becomes a function of the anterior insula. And for the posterior cingulate cortex, it's more of that part of the brain that promotes exploration. Everything else that we mentioned is what's called exploitation, you know. This is exploration. I don't know what the outcome to expect. I don't know anything about the stimulus. I don't know anything about which response I need to make. I just go ahead and explore without, you know, pre-existing thoughts or pre-existing, responses or pre-existing outcome assessments. Okay, guys, this is it for today. Any questions? شكله بلش يصيبكم mental exhaustion يا جماعة انتم من neuroscience too basically. So I understand. By the way, I get tired as well, so I just want to tell you it's very challenging to teach in the beginning of the day and then ultimately live with the thirst for the rest of the day for Ramadan. So at least you get to, you know, replenish your, water stores and glucose stores very soon. So any questions?
دكتور بالنسبة للإكسبلويتيشن point اللي قلتها versus exploitation as in زي كيف إحنا we expect a reward so we exploit that.
Yep, exploiting meaning that we use already stored information.
Okay.
As opposed to exploration where I don't know what to do, how to think about it, what kind of response, what kind of outcome. So we just keep exploring or just navigating the environment basically, okay?
شكرا.
Happily. Any other questions? Okay, Jamal. If that's the case, then good luck to you, and we'll see you on Wednesday for the last lecture on language, and with that we conclude our discussion of the neurophysiology too. نراكم وقتها. السلام عليكم.